Hello, and welcome to our two-part video series on communication. In this first video, we're going to identify the communication cycle so that at any time you can identify a place within the cycle that you could benefit from applying more focus. In the second video, we're going to identify some differences between the communication styles of men and women so that you can be more successful with communicating with the opposite sex. For the purpose of this video, we're going to define communication as an attempt to express a feeling or a thought to an audience. Communication is a lot more than just the words we use. In fact, the words we use make up the smallest piece of the pie of our communication. So if we look here, the words we tend to use only make up about 10% of successful communication. This is why text messages can be so ineffective. Have you ever texted someone and what would have only taken a minute or two with a phone call or a face-to-face conversation takes much longer than that with a text message? That's because words alone aren't very effective. That's also why we generally tend to add a lot of emojis in our text messages, trying to increase the effectiveness of words. If we add to the small percentage of words the tone we use with our words, we increase our effectiveness, but even with these two pieces combined, we're still less than 50% effective at communicating. Our body language speaks so much more than the words we use or the tone of voice we use. This is why so often, in an attempt to avoid an argument, a person that only chooses to watch their words or watch their tone of voice will ultimately fail in avoiding an argument. Consider this. Consider this. In both of those examples, there was an emotion communicated, but no words were used. So if I want to be more effective at communicating with others, I benefit the most from focusing on my body language. This includes my facial expressions, this includes my posture, this includes the eye contact that I make with others. This also includes the way that I respond physically when I listen to someone else. So again, if I want to be more effective at communicating with others, I benefit the most from focusing on improving my body language, making sure that my body communicates what I really want my audience to understand. Now let's break down the cycle of communication. If I have a message that I want to send to an audience, either I want to communicate an emotion or I want to communicate a thought to my audience. As the sender, first, I need to understand the idea that I want to send. This is ultimately what I want to communicate to someone else. If I begin speaking before I understand what I want to say, that's going to make my message very difficult to understand for my receiver. If I'm misunderstood, I might get frustrated. If I get frustrated, this is going to further cloud my communication. The cycle is going to spiral downwards. If before I speak, I understand the idea that I want to communicate, before I get started sending my message, I'm already starting off on a more positive note. Knowing what I want to say isn't enough. I also need to understand my audience. Who is it that I'm trying to communicate to? Communicating with a 10-year-old boy, communicating with a 45-year-old woman, communicating with a college student, communicating with a stranger you've just met in the grocery store, communicating with a sports fan who's a fan of the same team as yours, communicating with a sports fan who's a fan of your favorite team's rival, communicating with someone that cooks a lot about food dishes, communicating with someone that doesn't cook very much about food dishes. The better I understand my audience, the better I get to cater my message for them. This is going to increase the likelihood that my message will be understood by the person I'm speaking to. I need to understand what I want to say. I need to understand who I want to say it to. And again, we're not just limiting our communication to our words. It's also very important to watch our body language throughout the communication process. Once I understand what I want to say and I understand who I want to say it to, I have to make sure that my delivery is best for them. I have a message, but I want it to be received. I increase the likelihood that my message will be received if I make sure my delivery fits their desires and also that it's a good time for them to be receiving messages. If I have negative body language, it's going to limit how much my receiver is wanting to listen to what I have to say. If my audience is busy, it might not be the best time to try to communicate with them. That's going to limit my effectiveness. If I want my message ultimately to be received, it's in my best interest to make sure that my delivery is well and also it's a good time for my receiver. Once I start delivering my message, I have to understand what their perception is of my message. When I communicate to someone else, I'm not the one who gives my message meaning. The receiver does. Whatever it is that I say, however it is that I say it, the receiver, my audience, they're going to process that message and they're going to give that message some meaning. So as I communicate with my audience, I have to watch for feedback that's going to help me understand what their perception is of my message. Sometimes we say something to someone and it's taken the wrong way. Sometimes when we give our message to our audience, what they understand is completely different from the message we're trying to send. If we want to be successful in communicating, what we have to do then is adjust our message so that it helps the receiver perceive the message we're really trying to convey to them. Sometimes we take it personally. We put a lot of thought and effort into what we want to say and how we want to say it. We deliver it in a way that we think is very positive. We ensure that it's a good time for our receiver. And with all of this effort, we're still misunderstood. We don't have to take that personally. All we have to do is convert our message to the language that our receiver best understands. The more we're willing to do that, and the more we're patient throughout the communication cycle, the more likely we are to be successful in communicating. This is a cycle. When I receive feedback from my receiver, I have to process this feedback. Sometimes that's going to adjust the idea that I need to communicate with my audience. Sometimes it's going to help me to understand my audience a little bit better, in which case I'm going to cater my message a little bit differently in my delivery. Sometimes I might understand that my delivery needs to be altered. Sometimes I might realize that this isn't the best time to be trying to communicate. Throughout this cycle, as a sender, I send the message the best I can to the receiver in the language that I think my receiver best understands, and I continually open to feedback from what the receiver gives me so that throughout the cycle, I'm continuing to adjust my message in the best way to be understood by my receiver. Join us in the second part of this video for some common differences between men and women so that you can be more effective at communicating with the opposite sex. Stay tuned.